Low fantasy versus high fantasy. What are the differences between these two subgenres? It can be kind of hard to tell sometimes, especially if you're new to the fantasy genre, but sometimes even veterans of fantasy can get this mixed up. Some people think it has to do with low and high quality of fantasy. That's not what it means at all. Luckily for you, I took it upon myself to investigate the distinctions between these two subgenres so I can pinpoint the defining characteristics of low fantasy and high fantasy. Low fantasy is defined as a subcategory of the fantasy genre in which supernatural elements intrude into our otherwise normal world. These stories take place on Earth, and a fictional version of Earth is still rational at its core. It upholds the fundamental rules that govern the universe. Typically, in low fantasy, realism is an important aspect. The fantastical components are often undertones, not the centerpiece of the story. Some prominent low fantasy works include Good Omens, American Gods, Neverwhere, and several other stories by Neil Gaiman. Outlander by Diana Gabaldon, a low fantasy historical romance. Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling is low fantasy. The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher, and Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. Now, low fantasy is in contrast with high fantasy, which are stories that take place in their own fictional world with their own set of rules and physical laws. They're often characterized by a large cast of characters, a massive and extensively detailed world, lots of magic and supernatural elements, and usually a very high page count. Now, often high fantasy and epic fantasy go hand in hand, and sometimes people even use them interchangeably. But the difference between these two is actually plot related. Epic deals with the scope and scale of the story. Something is of epic scale if it threatens the entire world or the universe. Often it involves an epic quest of a hero or a legendary figure, or it's telling the whole history of an entire kingdom. Now, high fantasy is set apart by its tendency to focus on its characters. It doesn't necessarily need to be of epic scale. Really, the plot could be about anything, and it could still be considered high fantasy. But in high fantasy, the world tends to have specific, well-defined magical rules. And again, it must take place on a secondary world, not on Earth. It can have many similarities to the real world, and it can have realistic elements, but fantasy is at the forefront here. As opposed to low fantasy, the essence of the setting is much more grandiose and theatrical. Supernatural elements virtually take over every aspect of high fantasy. The plot, the characterization, the dialogue, the theme, whatever, it's all influenced by the magical elements of the setting. Some noteworthy high fantasy stories include A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. Yes, this is high fantasy, not low fantasy. It takes place on a completely fictional world. Even if the magic is kind of low in this setting, it still has a ton of supernatural elements that make it stand out. I've lost count of how many times I've seen people categorize it as low fantasy. The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien. Obviously, this is a classic example of high fantasy. The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson, one of my favorites. This introduces a very unique and alien-feeling world. Malazan, Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. This is another high fantasy that is very epic in scale with an incredibly dense and intricate history to this world. There's a ton of examples of this subgenre. I'm sure you can think of some. Now, oftentimes, high and low fantasy exist on a scale. Frequently, you're going to see stories that incorporate realism and fantasy elements, and sometimes it can be kind of hard to tell which subgenre it belongs to, especially if it takes place on a version of Earth that maybe is way before history, or it's after some great cataclysm and Earth had to reset, and now there's a ton of fantasy elements. The Conan the Barbarian series takes place on Earth, so it's kind of low fantasy and high fantasy. Myself, I'd probably just categorize it as high fantasy, because the fantasy elements are at its core. If it is hard to tell what subgenre it belongs to, you need to ask yourself this question: does the other literary elements appear to emphasize realism or fantasy? Then there's stories that start off on Earth, but then they transport you to a completely different world, like the Chronicles of Narnia, Amulet, The Wizard of Oz, Alice in Wonderland. And these are called portal fantasy. Now, why does the difference between low fantasy and high fantasy even matter? Knowing the characteristics of both of these subgenres can be a huge help in a reader trying to figure out what their reading interest is. They can narrow down their list, identifying the book genres that pique their interest. From there, you can narrow it down to several different subgenres that you find the most interesting, and then find the perfect book for you. Which is more popular, high fantasy or low fantasy? High fantasy is actually the more popular choice. If you go to any bookstore and head to the fantasy section, you're going to see a ton of high fantasy that all have their own unique worlds. Obviously, fantasy writers like to create their own unique worlds with their own rules and everything. It opens up the floodgates of your creativity. But I do attribute a lot of the popularity of this genre to J.R.R. Tolkien. Obviously, The Lord of the Rings changed the fantasy genre forever. It's inspired a ton of fantasy writers, and it's going to continue to inspire many, many more. Is high fantasy or low fantasy better? That's where it all comes down to personal preference. Do you want to explore creativity and escape reality into an intricate fantasy world? Then go with high fantasy. If you enjoy stories grounded in reality but tweaking the natural workings of the world and that have a flair for the supernatural, then go with low fantasy. Personally, I love them both. I think it's good to mix it up. However, I probably gravitate more towards high fantasy. Let me know in the comments which you prefer. Also, leave any of your recommendations in the comments as well. Soon, I want to make an ultimate guide to fantasy subgenres where I give a breakdown for all of them and give examples for each. Anyways, that's the video. I'll see you next time.